Hello, my name is Ricky Pounds and I'd like to welcome you to this talk tonight. This will be a slightly extended version of the lecture I gave to the London Luminaries a few weeks ago, and it's on the theme of navigating bounds of loyalty, 18th century men of Twickenham in an age of political, religious and dynastic instability. Throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to the word Jacobite. For clarification, the word Jacobite refers to the followers of King James II and his descendants. The word itself comes from the Latin word Jacobus, meaning James. The Great Jacobite Rebellion of 1715 has often existed in the shadow of the much more famous brother, I suppose, the 1745 Jacobite Restitution attempt, led by Prince Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, known more affectionately. And yet the rebellion of 1715 was potentially far more dangerous than this later attempt to regain the throne for the Stuarts. To put the series of events which culminated in the 1715 Jacobite rebellion into context, it is worth providing a brief history of key events leading up to the battle, the origins which can be traced back to the year of 1688. In this year, William of Orange and his wife, Mary Stuart, travelled from the Netherlands to England in what has been known as the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution. The 1688 revolution, however, was for all intent and purposes an invasion by the back door, with Jacobites paralleling William and his invasion with that of his namesake, William of Normandy, and his military invasion of 1066. William's fleet consisted of 50 men of war ships, along with between 300 to 400 merchant ships. William's force itself consisted of almost 20,000 men, with between 4,000 to 5,000 horses, artillery, and even a printing press for propaganda. The fleet was over twice the size of the Spanish Armada that challenged England 100 years before. This invasion, in the face of insurmountable odds, forced King James II and his family to flee to France, and in his absence, William was crowned King William III, and his Stuart wife, eldest daughter of the deposed James II, Queen Mary II. The reason for this was that King James II was a Catholic, and on the birth of his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, in 1687, this forced a crisis for fears of a Catholic succession of monarchs. James II and his family fled the country, living first in France and later having the Stuart court and his followers settle in Rome, where the last Stuart claimant, Cardinal Henry Stuart, died in 1817. Now, when William and Mary died childless, the crown next passed to Anne, another daughter of King James II, who ruled between 1711 and 1714. When Anne died childless, the crown was offered to the next Protestant relation. This amazingly was a process where it skipped 57 closer Catholic claimants. This was Sophia, Electress of Hanover. Sophia was the daughter of Elizabeth, the so-called Winter Queen, older sister of the murdered King Charles I. Unfortunately for the Hanoverians, Sophia died on the 8th of June 1714, leaving her oldest son George, a non-English speaking German, next in line as King of the realm. And this brings us to the current state of affairs. The change of monarchs was the opportunity needed by the exiled Stuarts to raise rebellion and attempt to seize back the crown. So, on the 13th of November 1715, the two leaders of the opposing armies met at Sheriff Muir. Both had once been Twickenham neighbours. John Erskine, 6th Earl of Mar, had command of the Jacobite army composed of around 12,000 men. Now, Mar had previously held the position of Secretary of State for Scotland between 1705 and 1707. Opposing him, and with a government army of half that amount, around 6,000 men, was John Campbell, 2nd Duke of Argyll, whose ancestral home was Ham House, which we will hear about a little bit later. Now, the battle finished in a stalemate, but the Jacobites had lost the advantage and the impetus, and the rebellion quickly fragmented. Marr, together with James Francis Edward Stuart, who had joined him on the 23rd of December, were then forced to return to France, and Marr was there in exile for the next 19 years. Argyll considered himself to be the victor and struck this attractive medal to commemorate the victory. And here is the bronze medal for you to see. In exile, the Earl of Mar was elevated to the Jacobite peerage and invested with the Jacobite Order of the Garter. However, in the following years, Mar was viewed with deep hostility and suspicion by the Jacobite hierarchy, and for very good reason. Today it is known that Mar was receiving a pension from King George I, and a document discovered amongst the state papers in the National Archive in Kew in 2021 was written by the Hanoverian spy John Roberts and shows that Mar revealed key information to the Hanoverians, which led to the failure of the Atterbury plot of 1722. This dangerous plot intended to capture the Tower of London, the Bank of England, the Royal Mint, and other government buildings in Westminster and the City of London, together with the capture of the Hanoverian royal family. Erskine was known as Bobbing John, not only for the peculiar way that he walked bobbing up and down, but also his tendency to shift between different political allegiances. John Erskine still remains a very controversial figure in the history of Jacobitism. Now, nervously waiting in the wings for the outcome of the battle was the Scottish architect James Gibbs. Gibbs had much to lose depending on the result of the battle, but neither outcome was particularly helpful to him. The main reason for this is that both John Erskine and John Campbell, leaders of the opposing forces in the battle, were his friends and patrons. He knew them both on a personal level for many years. He would also have come regularly into contact with these men through his work in Twickenham. As an example, in the 1720s, Gibbs would complete a palatial property called Sudbrook Lodge for John Campbell in Petersham, close to where Campbell was born at Ham House in 1692. In the 17th century, Ham House had its own rich legacy of espionage, spying, double-dealing and conspiracy through Campbell's indomitable grandmother, Elizabeth Tollmarsh, and her husbands. Now, Gibbs thanked Campbell for his patronage in his early architectural career through the dedication to the Duke of his seminal Book of Architecture of 1728, which you can see here on the left, which he dedicated to the young military general. The help he received in his early architectural career was important, as for several years after his return from Rome, Gibbs was near destitute because of his known Catholicism and suspicion of Jacobitism due to his religious beliefs. As Gibbs is a major protagonist in this talk, I shall discuss his career in some detail. Now, James Gibb, the S was added at a later date, was born in Aberdeen in 1693, but little is known about his early life. However, both the Gibbs parents were Catholics, which in the latter part of the 17th century presented persistent problems. Following the 1688 revolution, Catholics were harshly treated under the new Williamite regime, but it is known that Gibbs' family received much provocation and persecution because of these religious beliefs. An apocryphal story can be used to highlight the situation at the time. Rumour persists to this day that in the years immediately following 1688, Gibbs' parents bought two dogs, which they sardonically named Luther and Calvin. The Williamite authorities did not see the funny side of calling two animals after their most revered figures and had them hung publicly in the local square. Violence against Catholics and non-jurors was common at the time, with Catholic gatherings forced to take place in secret and often being broken up by force by the Williamite authorities. It was against this background that James Gibbs went to Rome to train to become a Catholic priest, ultimately with the intention of returning and secretly spreading the Catholic faith in Scotland. Now, around 1699, Gibbs left for continental Europe, staying for an extended period with his aunt in Holland and ending up in Rome in October 1703. However, unfortunately for Gibbs, the sympathetic Scottish Jesuits at the Scots College in Rome had been replaced by hardline Italian Jesuits, who failed to understand the Scottish character and mistreated the new arrivals to such an extent that nearly all of them left. Feeling downtrodden and no doubt depressed, Gibbs left his religious training in August 1704 and sought another vocation. Gibbs had always been a very competent artist and later draftsman, and this led him to consider architecture as a major form of employment. Around the same time, Gibbs joined the practice of the master architect Carlo Fontana, and over the next 5 years, Gibbs learned all about the practice of architecture. In 1708, he returned with the intention of going to Scotland on account of his brother falling gravely ill. Gibbs learnt, unfortunately, of his brother's death en route and on arrival decided to settle in London, a city completely unknown to him, and yet he would come to love this city more than any of his contemporary architects. Gibbs can rightly be given the accolade of being the first British professional trained architect to come and be trained from Rome. Now, in the immediate years as a practicing architect, Gibbs received only a few commissions and survived basically hand to mouth. The triple prejudice against Gibbs come from the fact that he was a Catholic, Tory and a Scot. This combination meant there was a triple stick with which to beat him, and it made Whig aristocrats suspicious of employing him. In the later years of his career, many of his patrons were in fact Tories and Catholics, rather than the Hanoverian-backed Whigs and Protestants. However, it would be fair to say he did also have a few of these. By 1714, Gibbs had built up enough of a reputation to be appointed to one of two posts of surveyor for the commission to build 50 new churches. However, of the 12 actually built before the commission, only the Baroque-influenced Mary le Strand was built by Gibbs, a church much admired by the likes of the Earl of Mar. Now, before the completion of the church, Gibbs received information that he was to be dismissed from the position with the commission as architect of Mary le Strand. The reason for this dismissal was that the commissioners had received an anonymous communication stating that Gibbs was a Catholic and a dissident. In response, Gibbs replied that he was actually an Anglican. We now know that the author of this malicious communication was none other than a fellow Scotsman, the architect Colin Campbell, who was the author of the influential Vitruvius Britannicus of 1715, which was essentially a compendium of British buildings influenced by classical architecture. The reason for such a stab in the back of Gibbs was that Campbell was jealous of Gibbs and sought to claim his commissions. To the best of our knowledge, Campbell had never visited Italy, whilst Gibbs, of course, had been fully trained when in Rome. However, it remains a credit to Gibbs' character that he finished the church whilst being unpaid. Now, a second piece of very bad luck for Gibbs was that, of course, in 1715 we saw the Jacobite restitution attempt. Thus, Scotsmen and Catholics were tarred with the same brush and just branded Jacobites. The great irony of Gibbs' dismissal from the commission for building 50 new churches in 1716 is that he was replaced by the capable but very uninspiring, it has to be said, architect John James, who went on to build the Neo-Pelagian house for James Johnson at Twickenham and the body of the nearby St Mary's Church. Despite on the surface converting to Anglicanism, Gibbs remained a committed but secret Catholic for the rest of his life. When he died in 1753, Gibbs received the last rites. There can be little doubt that, particularly in the early years, that Gibbs fostered entrenched Jacobite loyalties. Indeed, it is likely that in the 1715 rebellion that Gibbs had to be physically prevented from joining the Jacobite army, probably by the Earl of Mar, but possibly by the Earl of Burlington. There can be no greater evidence of his loyalty to his great friend in that Gibbs intended to seek him out in France when Mar was in exile and pass on to him letters, and had to be dissuaded by his friends from doing so. But expediency and the need for sustainable income meant that in the end, Gibbs had to appear apolitical, and he accepted architectural commissions from Whigs, but his true clients remained those of Tory and Catholic dispositions. Perhaps James Gibbs' will, dated Thursday 9th of May 1754, gives the truest reflection of Gibbs' friendship, patrons and loyalties. For example, in his will, Gibbs explicitly acknowledged his gratitude for favours received from the Earl of Mar, and he made the Earl's son, Thomas Erskine, the major beneficiary of his will. Gibbs left Thomas £280 per annum, £1,000 in money, and jewels to the value of £300 or £400. In addition, Gibbs left Thomas 3 houses, these being number 9 to 11 Henrietta Street, their annual rent totalling £280, and all his silver plate. It is interesting to note that, unable to inherit his father's title due to the writ of attainder for treason in 1716, Thomas Erskine passed his time involved in Masonic pursuits. He was elected Grand Master Mason of Scotland in 1749. It is also possible that his father and Gibbs were Freemasons. And here we have a portrait of Thomas Erskine, and on the left-hand side we have an early to mid 18th century coloured engraving showing the raising of the Master Mason in the 3rd, or what's known as the Heramic degree. Now, another notable beneficiary of Gibbs' will was the artist Cosmo Alexander, who received Gibbs' home at number 5 Henrietta Street and its contents, except of course for the silver which was left to Erskine. Cosmo Alexander was a Scottish portrait painter. He was a supporter of James Francis Edward Stuart's claim to the English throne, and he fought for the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746. Arriving in Rome in 1747, he was commissioned to paint Charles Edward Stuart, and he continued to paint portraits of the exiled Jacobites as he travelled throughout Italy and then France over the following years. To come full circle, Cosmo returned to London in 1754, where he settled in a house left to him by the architect James Gibbs in his will. I just wanted to show you these 2 Jacobite portraits by Cosmo Alexander. You will notice the white cockade associated with the House of Stuart, the plaid clothing, and the small miniature portrait of Charles Edward Stuart with his garter star, sash and cockade in his cap. Now, I just want to briefly look at James Gibbs' architectural commissions around the Twickenham area. I previously mentioned his friendship to John Campbell and John Erskine. Erskine lived in Twickenham between 1709 and 1712 along the River Thames at Denby House across Deep, and we can see that there on the left. Mar was no stranger to Twickenham, as in 1703 he had married his first wife, Margaret Hay, at St Mary's Church. Now, one of Gibbs's earliest commissions was to produce alterations to the villa of his friend and fellow Catholic Alexander Pope at Cross Deep. Being a Catholic, Alexander Pope had been forced to rent land outside of London, as Catholics were prohibited from owning property in the capital, together with taking part in certain occupations such as teaching. At Pope's villa across Deep, Gibbs added a steep set of steps to the portico, but may have been involved in designing the villa as a whole. The riverside facade of the villa was later changed by William Kent. It is interesting to note that at the trial of the Reverend Francis Atterbury, from where the Atterbury plot takes its name, that Alexander Pope was a character witness called forwards in support of his friend. It is also interesting to muse on what position Alexander Pope would have taken if he had lived to see the 45 Jacobite rebellion. He died in 1744. Another property where Gibbs was commissioned to design buildings was at Witton Park, where he erected a large greenhouse 80 feet in length with a hipped roof and an open rusticated loggia of 5 10-foot bays. It was built in 1725 to 1726. Gibbs may also have designed a 40-foot triangular Gothic tower which dates between 1722 and 1748. Unfortunately, the Gothic tower was demolished in the early 20th century. Those keen on collecting 18th century Worcester transferware ceramics would recognise the famous Witton Anglers pattern, which I have included this example on a jug, bottom right. I think it highly probable that James Gibbs designed the triangular tower at Witton, as the pyramid was a form he used on occasion, particularly with his garden buildings. Examples seen here include structures at Lord Cobham's garden at Stowe, and even a small pyramid, unfortunately now demolished, from the gardens at Hartwell House. Now, another structure that Gibbs may have been associated with was the pyramid at Stowe, perhaps providing advice to the architect John Vanbrugh. In addition, Gibbs produced 3 designs for offices at Witton, which were never built, but were also illustrated in his iconic Book of Architecture of 1728. These commissions were given by Gibbs to Lord Archibald Campbell, sardonically nicknamed the King of Scotland because of his powerful influence on Scottish affairs of state. Archibald Campbell was the younger brother of John Campbell, who was also born nearby at Ham House. His grandmother was the formidable royalist spy and she intelligentsia, Elizabeth Dysart. Campbell was placed in charge of the affairs of Henrietta Howard at nearby Marble Hill House, and in particular given the purse strings in relation to her 66-acre garden. And there you can see her stood in front of her house on the right-hand side. John and his brother Archibald Campbell are prime examples of how family loyalties in this period can shift from generation to generation. In this case, from once being pro-Stuart to pro-William and then pro-Hanoverian. Around 1716, James Gibbs was also responsible for designing an octagonal room for former Secretary of State James Johnson, a property located nearby the soon-to-be-built Marble Hill House. I will return to this at the end of this talk, as when it comes to conspiracy and betrayal, James Johnson, his brother Alexander, and their father really were in a league of their own. Now, slightly further afield, James Gibbs was employed by the Neo-Palladian aristocratic architect Lord Burlington to design a building in his garden at Chiswick. It is known that from around 1716, Gibbs produced a design, again published in his book on architecture, of a pagan or heathen temple which was situated in the middle avenue of the Patois, or the Goosefoot. Unfortunately, the temple was demolished under the later Dukes of Devonshire, but paintings by the like of Peter Andreas Rysbrack show the temple in situ, and you can see it right in the centre here. Unfortunately for James Gibbs, he was dismissed by Lord Burlington from his work at Chiswick and Burlington House. This may have been on account of the influence of the aforementioned Colin Campbell, who was constantly attempting to undermine him and gain commissions from the dismissed James Gibbs. And here are 2 images of that beautiful curving colonnade, which was designed by James Gibbs and unfortunately demolished. The political leanings of Lord Burlington have themselves come under suspicion in the last 30 or so years, as the prominent Whig grandee is now suspected of harbouring his own Jacobite loyalties. Research conducted by James Clark revealed Jacobite code names in the Stuart papers at Windsor Castle, from which Lord Burlington can be identified. These include the names Mr. Buck, Lamb and code number 2376 in Zech Hamilton's cipher. In 2020, research carried out on behalf of the National Trust proved that Lord Burlington's brother-in-law, Henry Bedingfeld of Oxburgh Hall, was sending substantial amounts of money to the Stuart court in exile. What is more, the money was being sent at a time when he and Lord Burlington were together in France at locations unknown. Payments reaching Henry Bedingfield were also being made at the same time by a Mr. Andrew Crotty, Burlington's agent in Ireland, also known in private as the Great Jacobite. What can be deduced here is that money laundering was taking place, involving unusually large amounts of money, which were being sent to the Stuart court. Weapons were also being concealed by Bedingfield from government forces, whilst Burlington is recorded as dealing in sugars, a code name for swords. Now, further evidence for the Bedingfields' Jacobite sympathies is provided by a magnificent collection of Jacobite drinking glasses, which were discovered at Oxburgh Hall in 1907. The story goes that a visiting journalist was inquiring about the family's Jacobite loyalties, and the then owner, Sir Henry Bedingfield, remembered seeing some unusual glasses from when he was younger. Moving to the china cupboard, there between hundreds of pieces of modern glass were 11 superb Jacobite glasses, thick with dust. The glass was dated to around 1745, the same period in which Bedingfield was married to Lord Burlington's sister Elizabeth. You will also notice that one of the glasses is engraved with the image of Charles Edward Stuart, which we can also see here on the right, painted by Alan Ramsay in around 1745. Interestingly, several of the symbols decorated on the Jacobite drinking glasses, including roses, thistles, stylized sunflowers and fleur-de-lis, also appear on carved chimney pieces in the Red Velvet Room at Chiswick House. Now, also at Oxburgh Hall is an unusual portrait of Charles Boyle, dressed in the robes of the Order of the Garter. Now, Boyle never received the Garter from a ruling British monarch, but it is possible that he may have received it from the exiled King James II. This painting, for example, is almost a near exact copy of the portrait of King Charles II in his full Garter robes by Peter Lely, but here the face has been replaced with that of Charles Boyle. Such secret Jacobite loyalties seem to have run in the Boyle family. This is not surprising, as in the early 1660s the Boyle family were given the choice of earldom by King Charles II for helping his mother, Henrietta Maria, at Bridlington Bay in the English Civil War. The title chosen by the Boyles was Burlington, a corruption of Bridlington, and just interesting fact here, Bridlington was where William Kent was born and was brought up. In the Green Velvet Room at Chiswick House is a large painting of Charles Boyle, 2nd Earl of Burlington, with two of his friends, Evelyn Pierrepont, the 1st Duke of Kingston upon Hull, and Admiral John Berkeley, 3rd Baron Berkeley of Stretton. The subject of this painting is worthy of investigation, as these three gentlemen sit in a dark, sparsely furnished room, and on the table in front of them is just bread and wine. Now, the symbolism in this painting is very reminiscent of the Last Supper of Christ, with the three aristocrats toasting an individual who they may or may not see again. The triple portrait was executed by the Swedish artist Michael Dahl in around 1690, just 2 years following the Glorious Revolution. In this respect, the person they are toasting is almost certainly the recently exiled King James II. The messianic imagery would not have been lost on the Stuart faithful, as in Stuart propaganda the murder of King Charles I was promoted in the same terms as the crucifixion of Christ, even to the extent of the letters CH, which began their names, being used interchangeably. Perhaps the greatest visual expression of the deliberately orchestrated parallels between the Passion of Christ and the murder of Charles I can be seen in the frontispiece of the so-called King's Book of 1649, which it was believed were the words of Charles himself. He holds in his hands a crown of thorns as he prepares to substitute his corruptible earthly crown for the incorruptible crown of heaven. To his left are weighted palm fronds. In this depiction of the murder of King Charles I, A lady can be seen fainting at the back of the crowd. That's on the left here. This was a direct reference to the three Marys present at the crucifixion of Christ, who were often shown gathered around the base of the cross. After the beheading, spectators would surge forward to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of King Charles I and cut off locks of his hair. Such objects would be passed down as heirlooms to future generations and were often believed to possess talismanic, if not supernatural qualities. In the next two slides, I've put together some paragraphs highlighting the deliberate parallels between Jesus Christ and King Charles I, in particular focusing on the Passion of Christ. I will leave you to read them at your own leisure, just by pausing them and then going on to the next one. It is worth stating here that a key belief of the Stuarts was the attribute of divine right and recurrence, the belief that the return of the Stuarts was inevitable and preordained. The Stuarts had returned once already with the death of their king and the return from exile of King Charles II in 1660. For the Jacobites, a second return of either James or his children, or indeed grandchildren, was inevitable. Like the constant changing of the seasons, it was guaranteed to happen. Now, returning to the triple portrait at Chiswick House, on closer inspection, Charles Boyle holds a ring in his hand and places it over the rim of a glass of wine. The ring itself may symbolise the exiled king, as often in the presence of the monarch, the person presenting themselves would genuflect, bend the knee and kiss the ring offered by the monarch. For example, the coronation ring worn by King James II was believed to have been inherited by him from his grandfather, King Charles I. Now, in the mid-part of the 18th century, the ring may have been replaced by the wine glass itself, then engraved with Jacobite symbols and slogans. And this is the coronation ring worn by King James II and possibly inherited from his grandfather, King Charles I. The ritual of passing the ring over a glass of wine or water was symbolic of toasting the king in exile across the ocean. Such toastings were particularly prevalent after the 1745 Jacobite rebellion, which ended in defeat at Culloden the next year, with certain glass vessels, for instance finger bowls, being banned, as the secret toasting of the health of King James III was happening at gatherings where King George II was present. However, evidence within this painting offers the very tantalising possibility that a precursor to the toasting of the king over the water with a ring was taking place from the time of the execution of King Charles I, with cavaliers toasting the king in private and with politically aligned individuals who they could trust. The other two men in this painting are also worthy of investigation as they link to our story. The man on the left of Charles Boyle when viewing is Evelyn Pierrepont, the first Duke of Kingston upon Hull. One of his daughters, Lady Frances Pierrepont, became the second wife of John Erskine, 6th Earl of Mar, marrying on July the 20th, 1714. As we have seen, Mar was the main leader behind the 1715 Jacobite restitution attempt. His marriage to Lady Frances Pierrepont was a success in that it provided Mar with the funds to begin to clear his inherited debts. Here on the left we have the exiled Earl of Mar. You can see hanging from around his neck you've got the badge of the Order of the Thistle, which is the Scottish equivalent of the Order of the Garter. In the centre you can see you have a miniature of his wife, who is there on the right hand side as well, Lady Frances Pierrepont. Now, after the failure of the 1715 Jacobite rebellion, Frances had been given permission by the king to join her husband in exile. Lady Frances was the younger sister of Mary Mortley Montague. Lady Mary was particularly displeased with the alliance as she intensely disliked Lord Mar and was convinced of an unhappy outcome. Unfortunately, the stress of having a husband in exile led to a number of periods of mental health, beginning in 1728. She did, however, outlive her husband by 35 years, dying on the 4th of March 1767. The Pierrepont family were staunch Whigs, and this marriage appears to have been an insurance policy to protect themselves in the eventuality of a Stuart restitution, which was attempted just a year later. Now, to the right of Charles Boyle sits John Berkeley, 3rd Baron Berkeley of Stretton. Berkeley carved out a very successful career as Admiral in the British Navy and took part in several naval engagements against the Spanish and the French Navy. His father, John Berkeley, 1st Baron Berkeley of Stratton, had been an important follower of King Charles I and aided his escape from Hampton Court in 1647. He had been knighted previously in 1639 by the King at Berwick and was raised to the peerage in 1658 by Charles in exile in Brussels as Baron Berkeley of Stratton. Berkeley was also present at the baptism of Princess Henrietta Maria on the 21st of July 1644. After the restoration of King Charles II in 1660, Berkeley joined the Admiralty and was advanced to several senior positions, including that of a Privy Council. From 1668, Berkeley lived at Twickenham Park and was buried at nearby St Mary's Church at Twickenham, where he was to receive a very elaborate memorial. And here it is. Now, just to add, other notable memorials and burials in the church included Alexander Pope, who is ironically buried beneath a flagstone on which you just see the letter P. The royal painter Sir Godfrey Kneller and Thomas Twining and his wife. Memorials were carved by some very well-known sculptors, including Francis Bird, Peter Schmakers and Michael Risebrough. The artist of the Chiswick House triple portrait is also worthy of a few lines. Michael Dahl was a Swedish artist with a very good reputation. However, he did not enjoy a good relationship with the Hanoverian king and his family. Indeed, when Sir Godfrey Kneller died in 1723, George I needed a new court painter and Dahl was a leading candidate. This, however, was quickly aborted when Dahl refused to paint the portrait of the Duke of Cumberland, who would later become, of course, the so-called Butcher of Culloden, when he was just 2 years old. And here he is on the left with Queen Anne on the right. Now, Dahl was also suspected of harbouring Jacobite sympathies, partly on account of his Catholicism. Dahl had important friendships with architects James Gibbs and poets Matthew Prior and Alexander Pope, both of whom Dahl painted. It is worth noting that Sweden was a key supporter of the Stuarts in exile and were involved in some of the Jacobite plots to restore the Stuarts to the throne. Interestingly, like Gibbs, most of Dahl's patrons appear to have been Tories rather than Whigs. For anybody interested in viewing the triple portrait today, it's at Chiswick House in the Green Velvet Room, immediately above the doorway that leads to the gallery. Now, it is possible that originally 3 versions of this painting were executed, one for each of the sitters. We know, for example, that one version of this painting was in the 19th century, hanging at Evelyn Pierrepont's Great Hall at Thoresbury Manor, today a health club. I would now like to return to James Gibbs and one particular commission that he received from James Johnson to build an octagonal building on his land in Twickenham. Around 1716, Gibbs started to design the building, which Johnson requested to be built in the Baroque style, to counterpart the Neo-Palladian house that had been recently built in red brick by the architect John James, the architect who would soon replace James Gibbs as architect to the commissioners to build 50 new churches. Gibbs designed a Baroque building to appeal to Hanoverian sensibilities. James Johnson would have known that in Hanover both Baroque and Palladian styles of architecture were favoured, and as John James had already built him the Neo-Palladian house, the Baroque style would have complemented these ideas. As such, at an early time in the 18th century, the best architect to achieve this was, of course, James Gibbs, trained as he was in Rome. Needing the money, it was probably a bitter pill to take for Gibbs, designing a building intended for a monarch whose government deliberately ostracised and persecuted those of a different religious faith. However, Gibbs designed the room to be an octagon in shape in order to display the many facets of the garden. Johnson almost certainly asked for the near life-size sculptures of the Hanoverian dynasty in order to try and attract them to visit his property to be entertained. This was achieved by a visit from Queen Caroline and her husband, where the menu of the meal and its many courses is still preserved. Now, before taking a look at the Hanoverian royalist symbolism deliberately incorporated into the octagon, I want to first look at James Johnson and his traumatic upbringing. He was born on the 8th of September 1655. Now, Johnson was the younger son of Sir Archibald Johnston, or Lord Warrington. Now, Johnston grew up in the Netherlands after his father had been executed after the Restoration. In 1661, Parliament had issued the Indemnity and Oblivion Act of 1660, sometimes referred to as the Act of Oblivion. The Act was a general pardon for anybody who had committed crimes during the English Civil War and the subsequent Commonwealth period, with the exception of certain crimes, including, of course, the regicides that had signed the death warrant of King Charles I. Lord Warrington was included in the list for joining the Cromwellian regime in 1656, an act he deeply regretted later on. On the 1st of February 1661, he was summoned with others to appear before Parliament on the charge of high treason. However, he had already fled to Holland and then to Hamburg in Germany. He was condemned to death and stripped of his properties and title in absentia on the 15th of May 1661. In 1663, he was discovered in Rouen after royalist spies had followed his wife. With the consent of Louis XIV, he was brought to England and imprisoned in the Tower of London. In June, he was taken to Edinburgh and confined to the toll booth. He was hanged on the 22nd of July at the Mercat Cross, Edinburgh, around 100 yards from his own house off the High Street. I just wanted to mention a terrific read published a couple of years ago on the theme of the hunt for regicides across Europe and America, Robert Harris's truly superb Act of Oblivion. In the late 1680s, James Johnson was himself gathering intelligence in opposition to King James VII or II in advance of William of Orange's revolution. He was passing coded information from England to the Netherlands. In England, he was central to disseminating Williamite pamphlets and propaganda. In England, Johnson was rewarded at the court of William and Mary in 1689 with a diplomatic posting to Berlin, and then on his return in 1692 he was appointed as one of two Secretary of States for Scotland. Now, if having a father executed for aiding the Cromwellian regime and helping to depose a second legitimate king was not enough, from the time of the Glorious Revolution, John James, together with his brother, headed the Secret Service of spying and espionage, which used every means at its disposal to interrogate suspects, create double agents, and bring to an end Jacobite plotting. It appears that it was his brother, Alexander Johnson, who carried out much of the dirty work. And he used the full range of techniques that were available to the intelligentsia of the period. Now, returning to the Baroque octagonal room, for this commission Gibbs used the renowned stuccatori plasterers Giovanni Bagutti and Giuseppe Artari, who produced several life-size plaster busts and figures for this particular project. He would employ the pair on future occasions on his architectural projects. And here is a graph of the Hanoverian family. The figures that you can see in purple are the ones that I believe you see in the octagonal room at Twickenham. Now, the political programme of sculptures would have been fully understood by people of the day. As the visitor ascended the steps and come through one of the doorways through the window, immediately in front of them and at height, the guest would have viewed a plaster bust of King George I, dressed in a laurel leaf crown in the guise of a Roman emperor, and you can see him there dead centre. To the left of the king were raised profile reliefs of Prince George Augustus, and to the king's right, the Princess Caroline of Ansbach. In addition, at high level, were two female personifications of ancient Rome, both wearing Roman togas and one fixed by clasps. Now, the identification of this pair of ladies is unknown. However, I would like to pose a suggestion for these busts, who I believe would complete the Hanoverian family, this being Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, Queen in Prussia and Electress of Brandenburg, and mother of Frederick the Great, or King Frederick II of Prussia. She was the only legitimate daughter of King George and his disgraced wife Sophia. She was the sister of the future George II, who was believed to have hated her. But why two busts of her? I believe this was to keep the symmetry of the room, as it would have been disrespectful to have displayed a bust of the wife of King George I, also called Sophia Dorothea, who had been imprisoned for the rest of her life for adultery. However, after the divorce, Sophia was forbidden to remarry or to see her children again. Indeed, her name was removed from official documents. She was stripped of her title of Electress Princess, and churches in Hanover were no longer able to mention her name in prayers. She was in prison for the last 30 years of her life. Now, in around 1740, the entrance to the octagonal room was changed, with the stair now accessible one bay to the right. The purpose of this was to create a link building from the Neo-Palladian house to the octagon. In the Gibbs octagon above the door leading from the new doorway, a new relief was placed in position. This was a representation of the Emperor Augustus taken from Roman coins, and its position was then opposite that of King George II, which makes perfect sense as he was born Prince George Augustus. The overall iconography of the prevailing Hanoverian dynasty was very much allied in this respect to the authority of the ancient Roman emperors. And if you looked down to the right hand side, you can see the coin on the right hand side of Augustus on which this new profile bust was made. However, even though the octagon is a practical visual form to view the garden, and Johnson was a very knowledgeable gardener, one does have to wonder if James Gibbs had the last laugh at the Hanoverian iconography. For Jacobites, the number 8, or the number of sides of the octagon, was very specific, as King James Francis Edward Stuart was acknowledged as James III of England and James VIII of Scotland. In this respect, Gibbs' incorporation of the number 8 into the very architecture of James Johnson's new building, designed to attract Hanoverian visits and patronage, may have been Gibbs mischievously sticking up two fingers to Johnson and the Hanoverian monarchy that Johnson so obviously admired. Now, as a kind of adjunct to this paper, I just wanted to mention a curious little story in relation to the Twickenham area and the later Battle of Culloden. Following the defeat of the Stuart forces at Culloden in 1746, it was reported that a strange fence had been erected at Twickenham House. The metal fence consisted of over 137 rescued Jacobite swords that had been collected from the battlefield on the orders of the Duke of Cumberland. The points, pommels and hilts were removed. This must have looked a very curious sight indeed, particularly as the sun caught the swords, giving off a dazzling light. It appears that in 1746 Twickenham House was acquired by John Hay, 4th Marquess of Tweedale and Earl of Gifford. From 42 to 46 he acted as the Secretary of State for Scotland, and so was actively involved in the aftermath of the 1745 rebellion. The swords remained at the house until its demolition in 1888, when they appear to have been bought by a scrap merchant, and several are today on display at the Culloden Visitor Centre. So next time you visit the James Gibbs Room at Orleans House Gallery or the Green Velvet Room at Chiswick House, look closely at the architecture and the art, as what you see in front of you may not always reveal the whole story, and many underlying layers of meaning may still be there to be discovered and indeed deciphered. I thought it might be useful to provide you with some of the reading material that I found useful in this presentation and in general on the Jacobites, Jacobitism, the 1688 Glorious Revolution, Lord Burlington and James Gibbs. So I will begin with this first slide, which basically shows the Stuarts in exile in various countries with their supporters. These are a useful selection of books on Jacobites and their material culture, much of which of course was done in secret: toasting the king over the water, heirlooms, trinkets, things that could be hidden away, that were seditious, even treacherous. As you will see on this slide, I've concentrated on the military aspect of the Jacobite rebellions. Of course, if you'd like further information on any of these books, just do a screenshot. They are available at most good bookshops, and you'll keep you well informed about the Jacobite cause. And here are some other books on various aspects of Jacobitism, portraits, for instance, of the kings over water, because of course the Stuart courts in exile, although very impoverished, had a very rich culture of art, architecture, poetry and theatre, etc. Of course, Alexander Pope and the Destiny of the Stuarts, David Nairn as well, Jacobite estates of the 45, and poetry and politics in 18th century Jacobitism in Britain and Ireland. And here are just some of the books on the political aspects of Jacobitism: ideology, conspiracy, the challenge against the Hanoverian government, of course the Atterbury plot, which I spoke about in the body of my talk, 1688 Glorious Revolution, and of course the Tories in the 45, and the fact that they were largely barred from politics at this particular time by the Whig oligarchy. And of course, I suppose the best known aspect of Jacobitism and Jacobites, Bonnie Prince Charlie, of course, many books on him, and some of the best are here in this list. And of course there were a number of magazines, books, periodicals out there, and of course guides to exhibitions that can also be consulted. And in this final slide I've dedicated to the Neo-Pelagian architect Lord Burlington, and you can see two books on him on the left hand side here, and the rest are on the Scottish architect James Gibbs. And I particularly recommend London in the 18th Century, the second chapter in Jeremy White's excellent book, which gives you a very good idea about James Gibbs and his architectural practice in London. Thank you very much for listening, and if you'd like to hear more from me, please check out other videos on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.